Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, and in Yirtzeh Hashem today we will be learning Daf Ayin Hey Amid Aleph. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hadisunim Batzaru Bashivya, Haimnim Ben Bayom Ben Bayabasha, Hamakay Mirachem Alehem, V'Yetziah Mitzar L'Rvacha Me'afelu La'Oiro Mishiber L'Geula, Hashta Bagalo V'Zman Kariv and Emar Amen. Our learning should be a schus for Fu Shalema for Chava Hadassah, Bas Rezel Serel, Tzvi Ben Leah Miriam. Our learning should be a schus for Yisrael Ben Rachel, Yonison Ben Michal, and Yoel Ben Michal. The Rebbeinu Shalom should watch over them, together with all of our other brothers and sisters who find themselves in harm's way. B'chol Makom Shehem. Okay, so we pick up today on Daf Ayin Hey Amud Aleph, the very top line in the Shulchan Aruch, Siman Reish Tzadik Tes, in middle of Sif Aleph. So we've begun to discuss the halacha that one is not allowed to eat or drink. So Shabbos evening, going into Motzei Shabbos, the Mechaber told us yesterday that Misha Techshach, once we hit Shkia, so Shkia, according to us, we paskin like the Gra, Shkia marks the beginning of Bein Hashmoshes. So once we hit Shkia, you're not allowed to eat or drink until you make Havdalah. Now that's from 30,000 feet. Of course, there are details involved in that, and some of those details we're going to see now. So again, top line in the Shulchan Aruch, Ayin Hey Amud Aleph, says the Mechaber. The Mechaber just told us, in the beginning of Sif Aleph, you're not allowed to eat or drink once you hit Shkia until you make Havdalah. Aval, however, now says the Mechaber, if one was sitting and eating, and he began this Suda miba'od yom, if somebody started eating before Bein Hashmoshes, so while it was still Shabbos day, and now he's in the middle of eating when you hit Shkia, v'chosh, and now he hits Shkia, ein tzarich lahafsik, he doesn't have to interrupt his meal, afilu mishtia, he doesn't have to interrupt his meal, he could keep on eating, and he could also drink. Now, we're going to see what the chiddush of those parentheses, the words of the Ramah, afilu mishtia, we're going to have to see what the chiddush of that is. But right away now, what the Mechaber is telling us is what many of us know and what many of us do every Shabbos evening when we eat Shalashudis. We start eating Shalashudis before Shkia, we wash before Shkia, we start Shalashudis, we continue eating after Shkia, we continue eating into the Bein Hashmoshes period without a problem. We don't interrupt our meal. That's because of this halacha. If you began to eat miba'od yom, then you're not mechuyev to be mafsik. You don't have to interrupt your suda. Says the Mishnah Berurah Cotton Beis, Yoshev va'oichel. You're sitting and eating. The Chavetz Chaim qualifies this a little bit. Says the Chavetz Chaim, va'afilu rak haschola ba'alma. Even if you only began your suda. What does that mean, you began your Suda? Sheberach berchas hamoitzi mi ba'od yom. You made the bracha of hamoitzi lechem in the aretz while it was still day. Could be you didn't even take a bite of challah yet, but you made the bracha of hamoitzi while it was still vadai day, before the beginning of Bein Hashmoshes, and then you didn't actually start eating until after Shkia. So you started before, but you actually started eating after. Still, that's okay. You're not mechuyev to be mafsik your suda. Miba'od yom. Now, here's where things get a little bit complex. Ois Cotton Gimel says the Mishnah Berurah, miba'od yom. Now, Mechaber said, if you started eating miba'od yom while it's still day, then you're not mechuyev to interrupt your suda. Now, first of all, says the Chavetz Chaim like this. First of all, realize, dafka bazeh shehischalecho beheter. This halacha of the Mechabers, that you're not mechuyev to interrupt your suda, that's only true if you started eating beheter. You started eating during a time that you were allowed to start eating. You started eating miba'od yom. Aval im hischil be'isser. But let's say you started eating at a time that you weren't allowed to start eating. Then, paisik umavdil. Then you have to interrupt your suda. So now let's get a little bit into the weeds over here. There's a little bit that we have to put in that's between the lines. Again, the Mechaber started off this sibin by telling us that you're not allowed to eat anything, misha techshach, from when it gets dark, Once it gets dark, Shabbos evening, you're not allowed to eat anything ad sheyavdil, until you make Havdalah. Now, in the previous shir, the Chavetz Chaim qualified that a little bit. If you take the words of the Mechaber at face value, it sounds like what the Mechaber is saying is, you have up until Shkia to start eating. Once you hit Shkia, you're not allowed to start eating. That's it. You hit Shkia, you're not allowed to start eating. You can't eat anything, you can't drink anything except water until you make Havdalah. But in the Mishnah Berurah yesterday, we saw that that's not exactly so. What we saw in the Mishnah Berurah yesterday is that after Shkia, you're still allowed to eat Shalashudas. If you didn't eat Shalashudas yet, and you hit Shkia, said the Mishnah Berurah, you're still allowed to eat. How long do you have? How long do you have that you could still start eating after Shkia? He said until it's a half an hour before Tzeisak Echavim. So the numbers that I gave you in the previous shir were, according to Rav Moshe, here in the New York metropolitan area, Tzeisak Echavim, even on the longest day of the year, is 50 minutes after Shkia. Okay? The Chavetz Chaim says, if you didn't eat Shalashudas yet, you could start eating Shalashudas until a half an hour before Tzeisak Echavim. So that would mean that you have 20 minutes after Shkia. All right? So, again, the Mechaber said, Misha Tekshach, once you already hit darkness, which we said is Shkia, you're not allowed to eat until you make Havdalah. Said the Mishnah Berurah, not exactly. It's not from Shkia. Remember, Shkia marks the beginning of Ben Hashmoshes. The fact that we're not eating during Ben Hashmoshes is already a little bit of a chumrah. So said the Mishnah Berurah, if you didn't eat Shalashudas yet, you could still wash and you could still start a Suda until you hit a half an hour before Tzeisak Echavim. So that means that you still have a 20-minute window after Shkia that you're allowed to sit down, wash, make hamoitzi, and start Shalashudas. So that would not be called starting your Suda be'isser. That would still be called starting your Suda beheter. So now let's plug that into what we just read over here in Mishnah Berurah's Katan Gimel. Says the Mishnah Berurah, mi ba'oid yoim. The Chavetz Chaim says, if the Mechaber said, if you start your Suda mi ba'oid yoim, you're not mechuyev to be mafsik your Suda. You don't have to interrupt your Suda to make Havdalah. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Dafka bazeh shehischelecho beheter. This applies so long as you started eating beheter. Avalim hischel be'isser, but if you started eating be'isser, paisek umavdil, then you have to interrupt your Suda and you have to make Havdalah. So when you put all this together, what it sounds like to me is, so long as you start eating within 20 minutes after Shkia, that's not called Be'isser, that's called Beheter. Since you started your Suda Beheter, you're not mechuyev to interrupt your Suda for Havdalah. But if you wash and you sit down to start your Suda 25 minutes after Shkia, a half hour after Shkia, now you're within a half an hour of Tzeisak Echavim. Now it's already you started Be'isser. If you started Be'isser, as soon as you look at the clock and you realize, oy vey, I started eating too late. It's already a half an hour to tzeis. Now you're mechuyev to interrupt your meal, and you can't continue eating until the proper time for Havdalah comes, and you make Havdalah. Now, the Mishnah Berurah points out an interesting technicality. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the truth is, af belav hachi, without this halacha, without which halacha? We're dealing over here with the halacha of eating before Havdalah. Says the Chavetz Chaim, the truth is, belav hachi, without that halacha, still tzarich lifsaik, you would be mechuyev to interrupt your Suda. If you started your Suda within a half an hour of Tzeisak Echavim, then forget the halacha of Havdalah. You're mechuyev to interrupt your Suda anyway. Why? Mishum kriya shema shel arvis, shehi daraisa. Because take Havdalah out of the equation. If you're within a half an hour of Tzeisak Echavim is the Zman of Kriya Shema Shalayla. That's when you could start saying Kriya Shema of the night. So if you're within a half an hour of Tzeisak Echavim, you're already within a half an hour of the Zman of Kriya Shema Shalayla, which is a mitzvah daraisa. Now the halacha is that when it comes to a mitzvah daraisa, if you start eating beheter, if you start eating early enough that you were allowed to start eating, which means more than a half an hour before Tzeitzek Chavim. Again, take Havdalah out of the equation, take Shabbos out of the equation. Let's say it's a Tuesday night. Tuesday night, once you get within a half an hour of Tzeitzek Chavim, you're not allowed to wash and sit down and start a meal. Why? Because it's within a half an hour of the Zman of a Mitzvah Say Daraisa, the Mitzvah Say of Kriya Shema Shalayla. You're not allowed to wash and start a Sudas Kva within a half an hour of the Zman of a Mitzvah Say Daraisa. Why? Because we're afraid you're going to get busy with your Suda, and your Suda is going to stretch and stretch and stretch, and you're going to miss out on the Mitzvah of Kriya Shema. So the halacha is, we learned this in Siman Reish Lamed Hey in Chelik Beis. We learned that within a half an hour of Tzeitzek Chavim, you're not allowed to wash and sit down and start a Sudas Kva. So says the Mishnah Berurah over here, we're telling you that when it comes on Motzei Shabbos, the Mechaber tells us a halacha, you're not allowed to eat, Misha Techshach. Once it gets dark, you're not allowed to eat until you make Havdalah. If you started eating, if you were already eating and you started your meal miba'od yom, if you started your meal during the day, so you started your meal before Shkia, then you're not mechuyev to interrupt your meal for Havdalah. Why? Because you started eating beheter. Since you started eating beheter, you could continue eating. You're not mechuyev to interrupt your meal. Said the Chavetz Chaim, really, based on what we learned yesterday, you could start your meal even within 20 minutes after Shkia. But once you hit a half an hour before Tzeitzek Chavim, now if you start your meal, you're going to be mechuyev to interrupt your meal. Why? Because you started be'isser. If you start be'isser, you're mechuyev to interrupt your meal. Now, says the Chavetz Chaim, the truth is that halacha has nothing to do with Havdalah. That halacha is going to be every day because of Kriya Shema Daraisa. Kriya Shema Shalayla is a Mitzvah Say Daraisa. The halacha is if you start a meal be'isser, within a half an hour of Tzeitzek Chavim, you have to interrupt your meal because you're dealing with the Mitzvah Say Daraisa of Kriya Shema Shalayla. So again, says the Mishnah Berurah, Ach balavach yitzarech livsai. Anyway, you would have to interrupt your meal. Mishum kriya shema shalavishi daraisa im hischelechol b'soy chatzi shosha koyd b'tzetzek chavim. If you start your meal, I don't care if it's a Motzei Shabbos, I don't care if it's a Sunday, a Monday, or a Tuesday. If you start a meal within a half an hour of tzetzek chavim, you're mechuyev to interrupt your meal because of kriya shema shalayla uchidei la'el b'siman reish lamed hey. Now, in Siman Reish Lamed Hey, we saw an interesting exception to this rule. Right now, there are some people who are listening to this, and they're saying, wait a second, every night of the week, I'm not allowed to sit down and wash and start supper within a half an hour of Tzeitzek Chavim if I didn't daven Ma'ariv yet? That's news to me. Well, there's a major exception to that halacha in Siman Reish Lamed Hey, and that is that if you have a minyan kavua, if you have a minyan for Ma'ariv that you daven with on every night, so then you're allowed to rely on the fact, I'm not going to miss Kriya Shema Shalayla. I'm going to my 8 o'clock Ma'ariv. So I'm not going to miss my Kriya Shema Shalayla. So if you have a minyan kavua that you daven with it every night, then you're allowed to start a meal within a half an hour of Tzeitzek Chavim because we're not afraid you're going to miss Kriya Shema. We know that you're going to daven by your minyan kavua. But on Motzei Shabbos, the Chavetz Chaim says you can't rely on that. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Ve'ein lisbach al kriyas hashamish lebeis hakneses. You can't rely on the fact that the Gabbai is going to call you to come to shul. Back in the day, it wasn't that everybody had a watch and everybody had a cell phone and a microwave and everybody was surrounded by clocks and they knew that they were going to daven by the 8 o'clock minyan. Back in the day in the shtetl, the Gabbai, the Shamish, would go around the streets and he would say, 5 minutes to Ma'ariv, 10 minutes to Ma'ariv. He would call everybody to shul. In Reish Lamed Hey, we said that during the week, you're allowed to rely on that. So, like I said, if you have a minyan that you know you're going to daven in, or you have the Gabbai coming to call you, or you tell somebody, please remind me to go to Ma'ariv, then you're allowed to start a Suda within a half an hour of Tzeitzek Chavim. But over here on Motzei Shabbos, the Mishnah Berurah says you can't rely on that. Ve'ein lisbach al kriyas hashamish lebeis hakneses, va'afilu b'makom shederech likros, even in a locale where that's the minhag, where they go around and they announce to people to come to davening, Ela im rogel leilech lebeis hakneses b'motzei Shabbos. The Magen Avraham and other Achronim point out that apparently it was very, very common. A lot of people did not daven Ma'ariv Motzei Shabbos with a minyan. They didn't go to shul Ma'ariv on Motzei Shabbos. There are different reasons for this. Sometimes because they probed a very long Shalosh Udis. We know Shalosh Udis, especially in certain circles, Shalosh Udis is a very, very choshev. I mean, it's always choshev. It's Su'udah Shlishis of Shabbos. It's the extra Su'udah that's tacked onto Shabbos, L'Kavod Shabbos. But in certain circles, Shalosh Udis is mamish, a very, very big deal. The Rebbes would say Shalosh Udis Torah for hours and hours and hours. So it was common that a lot of people didn't end up going to Ma'ariv on Motzei Shabbos. So what the Mishnah Berurah is pointing out over here is, you can't rely on a Tuesday night. You could start a Suda within a half an hour of Tzesek Echavim, because you're allowed to rely on the fact that you have a mini kavua that you daven in. You're allowed to rely on the fact that the shamish is going to knock at the door and say it's 15 minutes to Ma'ariv. You're allowed to rely on the fact, if you ask somebody to remind you about Ma'ariv, you could rely on that. And you could start a Suda within a half an hour of Tzesek Echavim. Says the Chavetz Chaim, not so on Motzei Shabbos. On Motzei Shabbos, we're afraid that you're not going to go to shul. And therefore, you cannot start a Suda within a half an hour of Tzesek Echavim. Okay, so just to tie this up over here, because it got a little bit complex. Again, the Mechaber told us a very basic halacha, and that is, just like we see that on Friday night, once the Zman of Shabbos comes, you're not allowed to eat, you're not allowed to drink until you make Kiddush. There's a corresponding halacha on the back end of Shabbos. On Motzei Shabbos, once we're reaching the end of Shabbos, in the words of the Mechaber, Misha Techshach, once it gets dark, once we hit the beginning of Bein HaShmoshes, once we hit Shkia, really, you're not allowed to eat until you make Havdalah. Because that's it. We have to bracket off Shabbos. There's no more eating anymore now until we reach Havdalah. The Mishnah Berurah told us in yesterday's shir, really it's not Shkia. Really, if you didn't eat Shalosh Udis yet, if you did eat Shalosh Udis yet, maybe not, but if you didn't eat Shalosh Udis yet and you already hit Shkia, you could go and you could still wash and you could still eat Shalosh Udis until 20 minutes after Shkia. You have that window of opportunity between Shkia and a half an hour before Tzesek Echavim. Now again, the Mishnah Berurah only says this if you did not yet eat Shalosh Udis. If you already ate Shalosh Udis, then after Shkia you shouldn't be eating anymore. Okay, today the Mechaber tells us, look, this that I'm telling you, that once you eat Shkia, once you hit Shkia, there's no more eating until you make Havdalah, that's only if you didn't start a meal. But if you sat down and you washed and you started a meal before Shkia, and now you're eating after Shkia, you're not mechuyev to interrupt your meal. Now, the reason you're not mechuyev to interrupt your meal, by the way, is because if you washed and you made hamoitzi, now you're in middle of a sudas kva. When you're in middle of a sudas kva, when you're eating now, you washed, you made hamoitzi. Now you go ahead and you take a piece of fish. Now you go ahead and you take a piece of herring. Now you go and you put some salad on your plate. We look at all of this as eating that began miba'od yom. Since you washed and you made hamoitzi before Shkia, all of the eating that you're doing now, we all look at it as eating that began before Shkia. So you started beheter, and therefore you're not mechuyev to interrupt your Suda. That's what's at the root of this heter. But again, the heter of the Mechaber is, this that I'm telling you that you're not allowed to eat until you make Havdalah, that's only if you didn't start a Sudas Kva. But if you started a Sudas Kva before Shkia, now you could eat after Shkia, you could keep on eating, you're not mechuyev to interrupt your meal for Havdalah. Pointed out the Chavetz Chaim. The Chavetz Chaim said, look, if you didn't start eating before it's a half an hour to Tzesek Echavim, then you could take Shabbos and Havdalah out of the equation. If you didn't start eating and it's already a half an hour before Tzesek Echavim, you're not allowed to start eating anyway, because it's within a half an hour of Tzesek Echavim, and at Tzesek Echavim you have a mitzvah say daraisa of Kriyash Mashalayla. So once you hit within a half an hour of the Zman of a mitzvah say daraisa, you're not allowed to start eating anymore. Okay, now let's go weiter in the Mechaber. Says the Mechaber's second line. So we've covered so far, if you sat down to eat a Suda, and you started the Suda beheter, mi ba'od yom. You started the Suda before Shkia. But how about if you didn't start a Suda before Shkia? How about if before Shkia, you sat down, you took a bottle of orange juice, you started drinking orange juice, you're eating some potato chips, There's a bar priya adama. You're having an apple, a bar priya eitz. So you're eating, but it's not a suda. You didn't wash, and you didn't make hamaitzi. Now you started before shkia, and now you want to continue eating after shkia. Are you allowed to do that before you make Havdalah? Says the Mechaber, no. If you're sitting and you're drinking. Now this Mechaber is not dafka drinking. What he means is that you're sitting and you're eating, but you're not having a suda. What does that mean that you're not having a suda? You didn't wash and you didn't make hamaitzi. So this is not a suda. You're drinking, you're eating potato chips, you're having an apple. So you're eating, but you're not having a suda. If you're sitting and you're snacking outside of a suda's kva, and now you hit shkia, tzarich lahafsik. Now you do have to stop eating. If you washed a minute before shkia and you made hamaitzi, now you could keep on eating. You could have gefilte fish, you could have herring, you could have your potato chips, you could have your apple. You could keep on eating as long as you want. You don't have to interrupt your suda. But if you didn't wash, if you sat down even before shkia, you sat down 10 minutes before shkia, and you're having a paitis tish. You had an apple, and you're having grapes, and you're having some orange juice, and you're having some potato chips, and you're having some chocolates, and you're eating all of this stuff, and now it hits shkia. Now you got to stop. Now, I'll just tell you why that is. The reason is because, like I told you before, when you wash and you make a sudas kva, all of the eating that you do as part of that meal goes by when you began the meal. If you washed 5 minutes before shkia, even if you're eating 45 minutes after shkia, that's when you're eating your gefilte fish and your herring. We look at it as eating that started before shkia. Because it's all part of a suda. It's all within the context of a suda that began before shkia. But when you don't wash, when your eating is not in the context of a suda's kva, then let's say you eat an apple a minute before shkia, and then 2 minutes after shkia, you want to eat some herring. When we see you take the fork and stick it in the herring, we don't see it as a continuation of the apple that you ate 5 minutes before shkia. No, the apple that you ate 5 minutes before shkia was an act of eating before shkia. And now the act of eating the herring is an act of eating after shkia. It's not wrapped within the context of a suda. If it's within the context of a suda, it goes by when you began the suda. But if it's not in the context of a suda's kva, if you didn't wash and you make hamaitzi, then every single act of eating is a new act of eating. You're not allowed to start eating after shkia if you didn't make Havdalah. So that's why the washing and the creating of suda's kva, that's the linchpin over here. And that's what the Mechaber says. If you're only having shahakals, if you're not having a suda's kva, and now you hit shkia, tzarich lahafsik. Now you have to interrupt your meal. Says the Mishnah Berurah, we didn't do Mishnah Berurah Eis Cut and Dalet. We have to do Mishnah Berurah Eis Cut and Dalet. Ein tzarich lahafsik. If you have a suda's kva, you're not mechuyev to interrupt your suda. Says the Mishnah Berurah, va'afil l'kriya shema tefila ein tzarich lahafsik be'emtza su'udasai kemet shehischil miba oid yom dahaya be'eter. Says the Mishnah Berurah, if you started your suda's kva before shkia, and now you're eating after shkia, you're eating 10 minutes after shkia, you're eating a half an hour after shkia. Now, if you're still eating a half an hour after shkia, you're within 20 minutes of tzeisak echavim. Are you mechuyev to interrupt your meal because of Kriya Shema Shalayla and because of Tfilas Ma'ariv? No, says the Mishnah Berurah, you're not. Why? Because again, you started eating before shkia, so you started beheter. The halacha is if you start eating beheter, you're not mechuyev to interrupt your meal. And the Mishnah Berurah goes out of his way to tell you, don't be a machmir. Don't turn around and say, it's within a half an hour of Tzeitzek Yechavim. I'm going to stop eating now because of Kriya Shema Shalayla, Mitzvah Sei Daraisa. No, that's not the halacha. The halacha is if you started eating beheter before shkia, you're not mechuyev to interrupt your meal. And don't do it as a chumrah, says the Mishnah Berurah. You know why? Shema yamafsik be'emtza, because if you're going to go be machmer and you're going to interrupt your shalashudas now, nirek kemegarish hamelech. You know what it looks like? It looks like you're chasing away the king. What does that mean? It looks like you're in a rush to get out of Shabbos. I'm interrupting my shalashudas. So that's it. I'm ending my Suda that I'm making l'chvayt Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you don't do that as a chumrah. No, you're not in a rush to get out of Shabbos. We see a hint to this in the Mechilta. Zachar v'shamar, shamreyu b'yitziyasai, you should protect Shabbos on the way out of it. Ka'adam she'ena ratza sheyelech ayavay meyetzloi calls man sheyachol. It's like when you have a beloved relative who you didn't see in a long time and he came to visit you. Every time he says, I gotta go, you say, oh, no, don't go yet. Let's schmooze for another 5 minutes. Let me make you a tea. Let me take out another cake. You don't want him to leave. So too Shabbos. Hold Shabbos. Don't say, no, I'm ending Shalosh Shudas now because of a chumrah, because now it's within a half an hour of Teisik Echavim, Mitzvahs Kriyash Vashalayla, Tfilas Marveh. No, don't be Zazamachmir. The halacha is that you're allowed to eat because you started before Shkia. So keep on eating and keep Shabbos going. However, says the Mishnah Berurah, if you interrupt your Shalosh Shudas and you daven Ma'ariv, you're still eating Shalosh Shudas, and now it's already after Teisik Echavim. So you decide to daven Ma'ariv. Now again, let's break this down. So you started eating before Shkia. Once you wash and you start eating before Shkia, you're allowed to eat as long as you want. So you're eating Shalosh Shudas, and now you look at your watch and you say, wow, it's already Teisik Echavim. It's already Teisik Echavim, really you could daven Ma'ariv. Are you mechuyev to interrupt your Suda? No, you're not mechuyev to interrupt your Suda because you started before Shkia. Should you be machmir and interrupt your Suda? No, the Mishnah Berurah said don't be machmir, keep Shabbos going. But you decided to interrupt your Suda and daven Ma'ariv. Says the Mishnah Berurah, if you interrupted your Suda and you daven Ma'ariv, then Kasav Amagen Avram, now you got yourself in trouble. Kasav Amagen Avram, the Efshir Dechala Alav Chayvas Havdalah. Once you daven Ma'ariv, now you brought onto yourself the chiyuv of Havdalah, and now you're not allowed to eat until you make Havdalah. This is a very interesting halacha. We saw a hint to this in yesterday's shir, the top line of the Mishnah Berurah here on Ayin Hey Amud Aleph, where we also saw that once you daven Ma'ariv, it now brings upon you the chiyuv of Havdalah. So the Mefarshim say that what this is based on is a concept that we see on Erev Shabbos going into Shabbos. On Erev Shabbos going into Shabbos, let's say you make early Shabbos. So you're Makabel Shabbos after Plag. Once you daven Ma'ariv, you brought onto yourself the chiyuv of Kiddush. You're not allowed to eat anymore until you make Kiddush. So on the way into Shabbos, once you're Makabel Shabbos, once you daven Ma'ariv, you have the chiyuv of Kiddush. On the way out of Shabbos, once you daven Ma'ariv, you have the chiyuv of Havdalah. Ois Katan Hey, Yoshev v'shoyse v'choshchaloi. So the Mechaber contrasted the halacha of one who washes and starts a Sudas Kva before Shkia. If you wash and you start a Sudas Kva before Shkia, then you can continue eating after Shkia. You can eat as long as you want, and you're not mechuyev to interrupt your Suda. But if you're Yoshev v'shoyse v'choshchaloi, if all you're doing is drinking, or all you're doing is eating apples and potato chips, so you're not having a Sudas Kva, you didn't wash, then you are mechuyev to interrupt your Suda once you hit Shkia. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what does this mean? Yoshev v'shoyse, you're sitting and you're drinking. Hainu sheyashav lishtois v'ba'od yom. This means that you sat down to drink or to eat snack foods, not a Sudas Kva, miba'od yom, before Shkia, while it was still day, but v'loy b'soich HaSuda, but not in the context of a Suda. You didn't wash. V'choshchaloi, and now you hit Shkia. V'afilu im rak nases sofik chashecha, tzarek la'afsik. Even if it's only ben hashmoshes, it's Shkia. You got to interrupt your meal. T'shtia lav davar choshevu. Because drinking or eating potato chips doesn't create a kvius. It's not a Suda. Shetoyel as chalasei mi ba'od yom. And like I explained before, when you start a Suda mi ba'od yom, so then all the eating that you do is within the context of a Suda, and the Suda began mi ba'od yom. It began beheter before Shkia, so now you can continue eating as long as you want. But when it's not within the context of a Suda, so then every bite that you take is a new eating, and you're not allowed to start eating after Shkia if you didn't make Havdalah. Continues the Mechaber, second line down, near the end of the line. V'yeshayimrim, there is a yeshayimrim, brings us down from the smag. V'yeshayimrim, tahani mili b'safik chashecha, that this is only true when you hit ben hashmoshes. This halacha, that if you start a Suda mi ba'od yom, you're not mechuyev to interrupt it after Shkia, because you're not allowed to eat until Havdalah, we are saying that by a Sudas Kva, you could eat, you washed, you have a Suda, you can eat as long as you want. But now there's a Yesh Omrim that's Machmer. The Yesh Omrim, there are those that say, Dahani Mili B'Safik Chashecha. This is only true when it's Ben Hashmoshes. Aval B'Vadai Chashecha. Once you hit, let's say, Tzeisak Echavim, Afilu Hayu Yoshev Eichel, even if you started a Suda before Shkia, once you hit Tzeisak Echavim, which is Vadai Laila, Pyrus Mappa, now you have to interrupt your Suda. How do you interrupt your Suda? Your Pyrus Mappa, you put out a cloth over your Chala, over your Suda, Umavdil, and you have to make Havdalah, and then after Havdalah, V'garmi Sudasai, and then you could finish your Suda. So this Day Shnia, this second opinion is very machmer. The first opinion says, you started a Suda before Shkia? You started Beheter? You can eat as long as you want. You could eat even after Tzeisak Echavim. Whenever you finish, you want to finish an hour after Tzeisak Echavim? You want to finish 2 hours after Tzeisak Echavim? You're going to have a long Rebbe Shal Shudis? You could eat as long as you want. When you finish, you'll bench and then go make Havdalah. The Day Shnia says no. It's true. If you started a Suda before Shkia, you could continue eating after Shkia. You could continue eating throughout Ben Hashmoshes. But once you hit Tzeisak Echavim, then you have to stop. That's the second opinion. Says the Rabbah, Haggah, V'aminik Pashat Kisfara Harishayna, but the minik follows the first opinion, which is Makel. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'yesh Omrim Dahani Mili, Kayal Masha Kasa B'dei Kamaisa. This goes back on the first opinion where we said, to be Hiskel Min Ba'od Yom, that if you start your Suda while it's still day, Ain't Tzarech Lahafsik, you don't have to interrupt your meal. Afilu Kishadasa V'adei Chashecha. Even if you hit Tzeisak Echavim, you're not mechuyev to interrupt your meal. Well, a day azu, but according to the second opinion, tzarich lahafsik, you would have to interrupt your meal by tzeisak echavim. Aval inyan lechatchila. But when it comes to when you could start your meal, ein nafkamina bein day azu l'dei kamaisa. There's no difference between the first opinion and the second opinion. Da'af l'dei kamaisa, even according to the first opinion, who's more makel, also lahaschilech al afilu b'savik kashecha. The first opinion agrees that you're not allowed to start a suda. You're not allowed to wash and start a suda after shkia. Unless, like we saw in the Mishnah Berurah yesterday, you didn't eat Shal Shudis yet. If you didn't eat Shal Shudis yet, you could still wash and start Shal Shudis within 20 minutes after Shkia. Okay, let's go to Sif Beis, 2 lines off the bottom here on Ayin Hey and Aleph, says the Mechaber. This halacha is interesting. We have to, according to the Mishnah Berurah, which is taking the lead from the Magen Avram, the words of the Mechaber seem to be a bit imprecise, but let's read it as the Mishnah Berurah learns Pshat over here. Hayu shoisim. Now, literally, this means if you were drinking. Now, the Mishnah Berurah says that's not really what it means. The Mishnah Berurah says what the Mechaber is telling you over here is like this. If you are sitting and you're eating Shalosh Shudas, what does that mean? That means you started Shalosh Shudas, and you did it the right way. You started Shalosh Shudas before Shkia. So 2 minutes before Shkia, you washed for Shalosh Shudas, you sat down, you made Hamoitzi. All right? You started a Sudas Kva before Shkia. Once you start a Sudas Kva before Shkia, according to the first opinion in the Mechaber in Sif Aleph, you could eat now as long as you want. You could keep on going, no problem. But now, you did an odd thing. Hayu shoisim, which we're going to define like the Mishnah Berurah, you're sitting and you're eating your Sudas Kva. Why does the Mechaber say drinking? I don't know. But that's the way the Mishnah Berurah learns Pshat. Hayu shoisim. You're sitting and you're eating your Shalosh Shudas, your Sudas Kva, with your Chala and your Hamoitzi, and you started before Shkia. Va'amru, bayu v'navdil. Now you look at the clock, and you see that it's already Tzeisak Echavim. So you say, bayu v'navdil. Oh, it's after Tzeisak Echavim. Let's make Havdalah. Okay. Now you created a Shaila. Why did you create a Shaila? Because again, let's analyze this. You started your Suda before Shkia. Now, really, according to the halach of Sif Aleph, you're allowed to eat as long as you want. You could eat and eat, and you continue eating even an hour after Tzeisak Echavim. You could eat as long as you want. But now you looked at the clock, and you said, oh, it's Tzeisak Echavim. Let's make Havdalah. Now let's break for a second, and let's say you're eating on Tuesday afternoon. On Tuesday afternoon, you're eating. So you're having a tuna fish sandwich. So you washed, you made a hamoitzi on your tuna fish sandwich. You eat your tuna fish sandwich, you finish your tuna fish sandwich, and now you say, oh, okay, let's bench. And now after you say let's bench, you look at the kitchen counter and there's a nice chocolate cake. And now you want to have a piece of chocolate cake for dessert. It's a problem. You know what the problem is? The problem is that you said let's bench. When you said let's bench, you were mesiach das. You removed your mind from continuing to eat. Mentally, you broke off your meal. You ended your meal. Once you were mesiach das and you ended your meal, your original bracha rishona is already gone. Your bracha rishona that you made at the beginning of your lunch when you started eating your tuna fish sandwich, that covered you for your entire lunch. And whatever you want to eat as part of lunch, you didn't need any new brachas. But now that you said havlon v'navrich, now that you said let's bench, you're mesiach das. Once you're mesiach das, you can't eat anything anymore because you would need a new bracha rishona. So now you have to bench. So you bench. You want to have chocolate cake? Have chocolate cake, make a bezoinus, and have chocolate cake after benching. Now let's go back to Motzei Shabbos. You went ahead, you washed on your shalosh shudas before Shkia. You made a hamoitzi before Shkia. You sat down, you ate. You're eating. You're allowed to eat as long as you want. Now you looked at the clock and you saw that it was after Tzezek Echavim. So you said, oh, Bayu v'navdil, let's make Havdalah. The question is, that statement, let's make Havdalah, does that constitute a Hesach Hadas? Does that mean that now mentally you ended your meal? Because you said, let's go make Havdalah. And now you need a new bracha rishona. That's what we're dealing with here. So says the Mechaber, how you shoisim v'omer bayu v'navdil, you were in the middle of eating, and really you could continue eating, but you said bayu v'navdil. You said, let's go make Havdalah. Says the Mechaber, im ratzu lachzer v'lishtais, if you want to continue eating now, kaidem Havdalah, before you make Havdalah, ein tzarech lachzer levarech. You do not need to make a new bracha. It's not considered a hesach hadas. But there are those who disagree with this halacha. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Zayin, ha you shaisim. You were drinking. That's what the words of the Mechaber mean. But says the Mishnah Berurah, and he brings this down. If you look at the Sharitzi and Ois Katan Yud Beis, he brings it down from the Taz and from the Magen Avram and the Tosefes Shabbos, and he says the Gra is mashma this way. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Hainu b'soich achilason. What this means, you were drinking. It doesn't mean stam you're drinking a cup of water. It means you're in the middle of shalosh shudas. V'aschalas achila haisa mibayid yain. And you began your Suda before Shkia. You began your Suda mibayid yain. Ulakach svir le'ladeh kamaisa. And that's why the first opinion of the Mechaber holds. The keven shaloyo yitzvicha lahafsik af shechoshcha. Since the halacha is that you're not mechuyev to interrupt your meal, even though now it's after Shkia, or even if it's now after Tzezek Echavim, ukidelael b'sef aleph, like we learned at Sef Aleph, ha'amir sha'amru bayu v'navdil, the mere fact that you said, let's go make Havdalah, ain't mazik lozeh. That doesn't damage your ability to keep on eating. It doesn't constitute a hesach hadas, v'rashon lecha v'lishtois, and you could continue eating and drinking, v'einam tzrichem lachzer levarech, and you don't have to make a new bracha rishona. Shalo yisichu daitam al yedei amirazu. Because this verbal statement, let's go make Havdalah, does not constitute a hesach hadas. Aval kishayu oiski b'shtia levad. But if you were doing what the Mechaber's words literally mean, if you did not wash, if this was not in the context of a Suda, if you're just drinking water, you're just drinking a coffee, so then, the tzarech lahafsik yishachashcha ukidelael, if you started a coffee a minute to Shkia, so then when Shkia comes, you have to stop. You can't keep drinking. Right? Because the next sip of coffee that you take after Shkia would be a new eating, a new drinking. And now let's start drinking after Shkia until you make Havdalah. Then, in Amru Bayu v'Navdil, then if you say let's make Havdalah, l'kulei alma hisichu daita ma'ashtia, then the let's go make Havdalah would zicha be a hesach hadas. And if you would want to keep on drinking, which you're not allowed to do, you're not allowed to, right? You would have to make a new bracha. I'm going to read Mishnah Berurah's Katan Ches, and then I'll just recap this halacha. It says the Mishnah Berurah's Katan Ches, Badavar, there are those who disagree with this. Sfir lay, they hold the Kevich Arbru by Even Avdil. Once you say, let's make Avdallah, Svichad Lachzor Levarich, you have to make a new bracha Rishona, because let's make Avdallah constitutes as Chadas, V'ikr Kedei Kamaisa, but the halacha Lamaisa follows the first opinion. So what the Mechaber is saying over here, again, according to the Mishnah Berurah, is as follows. We saw in Sif Aleph, if you wash and you start a Suda before Shkia, you're allowed to continue eating after Shkia. You're allowed to continue eating as long as you want. Comes along the Shaila, what if you say, let's make Havdalah? Does that constitute a Hesach Hadas? Says the Mechaber, no, that's not a Hesach Hadas. The halacha is, if you start your Suda before Shkia, you're allowed to keep on eating as long as you want. The fact that you said, let's make Havdalah, that doesn't create a Hesach Hadas that requires you now to stop your meal and would require a new bracha Rishon. That's what the Mechaber says. Says the Mishnah Berurah contrasts that halacha to what if it's not in the context of a Suda. Let's say what you did was, you started a coffee a minute before Shkia, and you're sipping your coffee, and you're still sipping your coffee after Shkia. Well, first of all, the halacha is, if you started a coffee before Shkia, then once Shkia comes, you're not allowed to keep on drinking that coffee, right? Because you're not allowed to start drinking coffee after Shkia. You're not allowed to start drinking coffee even 30 seconds after Shkia. Once you hit Shkia, you're not allowed to eat until you make Havdalah, unless you started a Sudas Kva before Shkia. Drinking a coffee is not a Sudas Kva. So you're not allowed to drink your coffee anymore. But you're an Avarian, unfortunately. You keep on drinking your coffee. So it's 10 minutes after Shkia, and you're still drinking your coffee, which you're not allowed to do. You're going against the halacha with every sip of coffee that you take. But now you went ahead and you said, oh, look at that. It's 15 minutes after Shkia. Let's make Havdalah. Now a new halacha kicks in. Once you say, let's make Havdalah, now it's a Hesach Hadas on the coffee. And now if you want to take another sip of coffee, which you're not allowed to do until you make Havdalah, you would need a new shahakal, because the let's make Havdalah constitutes as a chadas. Okay? Thank you so much for joining me for Liman HaTorah. The source of Liman HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rosh should send Yeshua's for first Parnasset Shidduchim to all those in need. We should be Zayich to see the Bias Goyal Tzedek, B'meher of Yameinu. Amen. Be well.